This is the video for Friday, January 22nd for students who are not in class. Starting with today's bell ringer, every society must answer 3 questions about how they will use their resources. The question that you need to answer is, what are those 3 questions? In a market economy, who answers the questions? And in a command economy, who answers the questions? So I'm going to play a couple videos, and hopefully these will serve as a review for what we talked about yesterday and will help you answer the bell work.
Before we get into what the paradox of value, we have to just figure out what value means. Now, value is hard because for econ, when we're talking about value and what people value something as, it's going to be different for each person. Because for you to have value for something, you have to have a need for it, a want for it. You also have to have utility for it. You have to get some satisfaction out of that product. And what you get out of that product, someone else might not get at all. So, for example, some people love to play video games, and others can't stand them. So for some people, they would be more willing to pay $60 for a video game than others. Some people might only be willing to pay $1. It has to do with the utility and the satisfaction you get out of that video game that would make you want to purchase it. The other thing that something needs to have value is scarcity. There has to be some scarcity to it. If it's plentiful and anyone can get it and it's available all over the place, well, then there isn't that much value there because it'll be easy to obtain. So for us to have value, we have to have scarcity and a utility. Now remember, utility will be different. So now that we understand exactly how to determine the value of something, and also why the value of something will differ depending on who you talk to, we can get into the paradox of value. Now the paradox of value looks at things that are necessities that are so cheap, especially when compared to things that we don't need that are so expensive. So let's get into an example here. If we're talking about water, you can go to pretty much any restaurant right now and get water for free. You can get water for very cheap. There's water everywhere. And water is very inexpensive. Yet we all need water to live. It doesn't necessarily make sense. The demand for water is massive, and we do have a limited supply of it. But water is very cheap to the point of where most of the time you can just get it for free. Now, it's not like that everywhere in the world. It depends on where you live and how much access to water you have. But on the other hand, something like a diamond is extremely expensive, and yet there is no real need for it. It's used for engagements a lot of times and jewelry, but it doesn't serve a purpose for us to survive. It's shiny and cool to look at, yet it's very expensive. If anything, if you're thinking about it, water should be a lot more expensive than a diamond because the water has so much use, and we need it. All human beings need it to survive. Yet it's the opposite, and that's the paradox of value. The paradox of value looks at things and it factors in scarcity. The only reason why water, even though that is a necessity, is so cheap is because it's abundant. Now, if you look at certain parts of the world where it isn't abundant, it's a lot more expensive. And the diamond we have received value for because it is such a scarce resource. And so that is why that is more expensive. And that's just the paradox of value, is looking at scarcity and also how we value things. And it takes into account kind of needs and wants. It tries to understand why something that is a need and a necessity can be so cheap, while something that doesn't really have a point can be so expensive. So hopefully the paradox of value makes sense. It'll look at this and it's always comparing two things. It's always comparing a need and a want, something that has a purpose and a necessity, and something that necessarily doesn't. Now, the diamond does have a purpose, it's just not a necessity to survive. 3 basic economic questions are what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. Every single society has to figure out how to answer these questions. They all do it in different ways, and there's no one correct answer. Each culture and society has a different idea of what these answers should be. So we'll be getting into how other countries answer them later on. Right now, we're just going to focus on these questions, starting off with our first one of what to produce. The society has to decide what they should produce. It's a pretty simple question, yet it's difficult. Should we as a country spend more money on social programs or the military? Should we be able to support more agriculture or industrial, or should we support the tech industry? What should we produce as a society? What do people want? What do they not want? All these different things are important questions for us to answer. And it comes down to 2 types of goods and services. Now, goods are things that can be used to produce something or maybe you buy. Now, there's a bunch of different goods that we'll get into in this class. Right now, we're just going to define a couple. And these will be important for you to understand right now. The first one is a capital good. Capital goods are goods that are used to produce things. They're used by businesses. So if I ran a store and I used an iPad to create my sales, my inventory, if I use it to email my customers and to set up the schedule, I'm using that to produce. It's a capital good. At the same time, an iPad could be a consumer good. Maybe I just want one and I go to the Apple store and purchase one for myself. That would be a consumer good. The other two types of goods that we'll get into right now are durable and non-durable. And the names kind of give it away. A durable good lasts longer than 3 years, while a non-durable good will last less than 3 years. So these are the different types of goods you'll have to know right now. Hopefully they make sense. The other thing that we'll get into is services. Services are another type of economic product. Now, this economic product can't be touched. It's intangible. They're tasks that are performed by people. Examples of this would be a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, police officers. All these are different services that society needs. And so there is an economic output there in a production, but it's not a good that you can physically touch. So hopefully that makes sense for services and the types of goods. Now we're going to get more into our economic questions. So we just talked about goods and services, and we talked about what to produce. And the only reason why we have to figure out what to produce is because of the fundamental economics problem. If you don't remember what that is, check out my video. You can click the card in the top right corner to go see it. Now we're on to how to produce them. And how to produce may seem simple, but there's a lot of things that could go into it. Let's say I'm opening a business in an area that has high unemployment. Well, maybe it would be better for me to produce my product by human labor instead of automation. Because with high unemployment, there's a lot of people that need jobs. And it might be cheaper for me in the short run, at least, to use labor instead of machines. Or at the same time, maybe there's tax incentives. Or maybe that there is no unemployment and everyone's working. So if I'm going to open a store, it'd be really expensive and hard for me to find labor. So automation would be better. All these questions go into figuring out how we should produce our product. At the same time, too, it depends on what we want our mission to be, if we want a certain perception, and all these things would factor into how to produce. The next economic question is for whom to produce. After we know what to produce and how to produce, you will have to figure out for who are you producing. Now, this is a hard question. All of these questions are hard and they seem so simple. Companies spend millions of dollars trying to figure these out. Think about it this way. If you're building a home, there's a lot you have to know. If you're trying to sell to people in the community, you want to make sure you know what's the average income there. What house can they afford? What features do they want? What colors do people like there? What size of yard do they want? All these questions need to be answered for you to create the perfect home for your target audience. Even the age range, the demographics, all these things are important for you to understand who you're producing for. All these questions that we've gone over, what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce, seem simple. Yet they're very, very difficult because scarcity is occurring and it's hard to know exactly what people think. So every society has to answer these questions. We'll get into different economic systems as countries and governments have decided ways to answer them for people. And at the same time, too, we'll talk about how businesses have tried to answer them as well throughout our course. So make sure.
Okay, so going back to the bell ringer, the three questions obviously are what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. And he didn't really talk in his video about market economy and command economy, so I'll go over that briefly. A market economy is the kind of economy that you're going to be used to, also called a capitalist economy, and we'll get much deeper into what these things mean later. But in a market economy, the short answer is that the market decides what to produce, those three questions. The market is a combination of producers and consumers. Producers are ultimately going to be the ones who make the decisions, but they're going to make those decisions based on what the people or the consumers want. In a command economy, who answers the questions? That's the government. So the example is if you're in North Korea, which is the only true command economy in the world today, what is it that the North Korean economy produces? They produce weapons, military, weapons of war, things like that. So the government makes those decisions. All right, so moving on to new material for today. We're talking about choices. We're all faced with choices based on the fact that someone is making something for us all the time. You may have fixed resources and you need to know your alternatives on spending money. What would be an example of a fixed resource? Go ahead and answer that in your notes. Pause the video if you need to. An example of fixed resources might be your income. Okay, you have a certain amount of money. You could choose to make more money, but for now, you have a certain amount of money, and so you have to figure out how much money you're going to be able to spend. My wife and I are in the process of looking to buy a house in Greenville. When we do that, we look around and we see how much each house costs. We would love to spend X amount of money on a house, but we don't quite have X amount of money. And so we are limited by our resources. We have a fixed resource, which is our budget, which is based on our income. Another example of a fixed resource is time. You have exactly 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, 365 days in a year, and you don't have any more and you don't have any less. So you need to maximize that amount of time. That would be a fixed resource. You also need to know that someone has set out specifically with a focus to make everything you see in the store asking and answering the 3 basic questions using the 3 factors of production. So you walk through the cereal aisle and you'll see a whole bunch of products that were made as a result of somebody who said, what should we produce? We should produce cereal. How should we produce it? They answered that question. For whom should we produce it? For people who like sugary cereal, or for people who like healthy cereal, or whatever it is. Now, the rest of this paragraph says the 3 factors of production. We haven't talked about that yet, but that is a key concept in economics that we're about to talk about right now. So these 3 factors of production, another way to think of factors of production are these are the 3 things that are needed in order to produce anything. And what are those 3 factors of production? Well, one is going to be land. A land is gifts of nature. Sometimes with land, you think of this picture down here on the bottom left. There's a field, is an open plot of land, but it's not just physical land. It's anything that comes from nature. So it could be fields, but it could be minerals, oil, livestock, etc. Anything that is naturally occurring in nature. Everything that is made comes initially from land because it comes from naturally occurring things. Metals are naturally occurring, woods are naturally occurring, right? So we're not talking about anything that's processed. We're talking about the natural, actual materials that come from the earth. The next thing is capital. Capital is tools and equipment used in the production of goods and services. So these are going to be machines, these are going to be computers, these are going to be really anything that acts as a tool or equipment. So factories, computers, robots, etc. So we're talking about if maybe we're making we're building a house, we're talking about the land being the wood, the land being the materials for the cement, the land actually being the physical plot of land where the house is built. And then for capital, we're talking about hammers and drills, maybe cranes, maybe all kinds of different things that we're going to use to put it together. But if all we have is land and capital, we're missing the 3rd piece of the equation. Because what do we have if we bring all the land materials and all the capital materials to our construction site? We just set them down. Well, it just sits there. We need a person to put them together, and that is going to be labor. This is the efforts, abilities, and skills of people. So people are going to together they're going to use the land and they're going to use the capital in order to build this house. And so it's going to be, you need all 3 of these things. You can't produce anything without land, capital, and labor. We're going to get later into the 4th factor of production, which is going to be entrepreneurship, because somebody has to organize the land, capital, and labor. Somebody has to take the risk in order to build the house. We can't just have workers randomly showing up with capital and land and building houses. So somebody has to take the financial risk to organize this. We're also going to have human capital because we recognize that a construction worker who builds a house probably has more skill in building that house than me, your economics teacher, right? So if I have less skill in that, I'm probably not going to be as capable of building a house, even if I have the same land and capital, and even if I work as hard as the construction worker has some certain skills. So that's going to be called human capital, and we will talk about that in a future lesson. But for now, the 3 factors of production that you need to consider are land, which is gifts of nature, capital, which is tools and equipment used in the production of goods and services, and labor, which is efforts, abilities, and skills.